Before I begin the sermon today, I would like you to find a pen or a pencil maybe in the pew rack in front of you and fill out the left side of the chart that's in your order of worship under the message section. If you prefer, you can also pull out your smartphone and note your answers there, but it is important for you to physically record your answers and not just think about them. So write down the first 5 things that come to mind when you think about how you've spent the majority of your time and energy this past week. That might have been at work, it might have been with your family, running errands, it could have been watching Netflix, commuting, whatever the top 5 things are that come to mind. And then next to it, the top 5 ways that you have spent your money and resources this week. Might have been paying rent or mortgage, or like me perhaps, paying for surgery for your pet. Maybe you spent it on groceries or gas, but just the top 5 things that come to mind. I'll give you a few moments to do that. Okay. We will come back to that later. I'd like you to close your order of worship now and look at the image on the front cover. Do you recognize this painting on the cover? Yeah, it's a zoomed in piece of a fresco by Michelangelo. And minus the iPhone, you'd find this painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He painted it in the early 16th century and titled it The Creation of Adam. On the screen, you can see the fresco in full. It illustrates one of the biblical creation narratives from Genesis in which God breathes life into Adam, the first man. In Hebrew, the word Adamah means earth. So God adds God's breath or spirit, ruach, to the dust of the earth, Adamah, and humankind, Adam, is created. The way I've always interpreted this painting is that this is the moment right after Adam is created, and God is slipping away, if you will, back into the heavens, leaving Adam on the earth alone. It suggests to me that God wants us to live and learn some things on our own. God does not hold our hand through life, even if we are held in the palm of God's hand throughout our lives. As beautiful as this painting is in its full perspective, the zoomed-in image of the near-touching hands of God and Adam has become iconic too. The late 14th century Christian mystic and theologian Julian of Norwich mused, "Betwixt God and ourselves, there is no between." And yet, the slight space between the hand of Adam and the hand of God speaks to me so strongly because it does feel like often something is between God and me. Whoever photoshopped the image on the cover of your order of worship agrees with me, I think. The iPhone, of course, represents so much more than a phone. It represents our lives, the photos and videos of the moments we never want to forget, the contact information of the people who claim our lives, the appointments and meetings that populate our calendars, the received text messages and voicemails of all those who have something to say to us, and the sent messages and outgoing calls to all those to whom we have something to say. It represents the 24-hour news cycle sending us alarms for every impending storm in our area, push notifications for every tragic event in our world, and tweets for every wise and foolish thing that people say in 140 characters or less. It represents the banks that hold our money and the continual rise and fall of the stocks that perhaps hold our financial futures. It represents the apps that we use to follow our favorite sports teams, to shop at our favorite stores, and even to capture our favorite imaginary characters as they float across our path in real time, Thank you, Pokemon Go. And for many of us, our smartphones also represent the Bible that we read, or the daily devotion that we have sent to our inbox every day, or the status updates that we check of our friends on Facebook, letting us know what's going on in their lives and perhaps how to pray for them. So hear me, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with iPhones. I have one myself. I'm pretty much glued to it. There's nothing wrong with technology in general, but what this smartphone represents, for me at least, is all various people and places and things that can come between me and God. I know that's not proper grammar, me and God, but the syntax is important there because the barrier is this direction between me and God, not God and me. You see, a modern way of looking at today's parable is that instead of a successful, wealthy man who builds more and more barns to hold his accumulating wealth, instead of dealing with the situation by perhaps sharing his food with others, you could imagine a productive, busy woman who downloads more and more apps to help organize and bring order to her personal and professional accumulating to-do lists. When things get too busy in her life, instead of creating more white space and clearing her calendar, she finds more time for work or for others by sacrificing sleep or those things which connect her to God. You see, making more appointments, in this case, is equivalent to building more barns. The barrier between a person and God might be different for all of us, whether it's money or time, but the effect is just the same. It's a life preoccupied with self and stuff, instead of a life occupied with God and the Spirit of God, which fills our souls, that spirit of love and gratitude and joy and grace, that spirit that has nothing to do with how much stuff we have. The way Luke tells the story in today's text, a man comes to Jesus needing help with settling a family inheritance issue, but Jesus sees through his query to the real question at hand, where the treasure of his heart lay. And seeing that it lay with money and not with God, Jesus tells him the parable of the rich fool, which, by the way, is called that because it's the only time in the Bible where we read that a biblical writer has actually had God call someone a fool directly into their face. I thank one of our former pastors, Larry Lowhead, for his clever wordsmithing about the main point of this parable. Every person needs means to live on, but we can't confuse our means to live on for the end for which we live for. We can't confuse our means to live on for the end to which we live for. That's what makes this man a fool. Not his abundance of money and external wealth, but his poverty of inner spiritual health. The problem is not with the size of this man's harvest, but rather with his need to keep it all and store it all for himself. Does the thought ever cross his mind to give it to the poor, especially perhaps to those who he would have had to call upon to help him build those bigger barns? I mean, just listen to the use of the first person in this text. It's absurd how self-reliant and self-focused this guy is. What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops? I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for your years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. There is so much sad irony in this guy projecting the future he will enjoy with his bigger barns, only to be told by God that this very night you will die, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? It reminds me of the rebuttal to the phrase, the one with the most toys wins. Perhaps you've heard it, when's the last time you saw a hearse pulling a U-Haul? We all go out of this world the same way we came in, with no material possessions, just our beautifully created soul. Every person needs means to live on. No one would want to deny the man in this story those means. And in telling this story, Jesus did not seem to be attacking this man even for his life of plenty. He was not criticizing him for his ambition or industry or success. On the contrary, we see later that Jesus commended the man for providing so well for his family. But I think that Jesus' wish and God's wish would be that provision would be there for every family to enjoy the same life of plenty that he does. Jesus wants every person to have the means to live on, plenty of food and clothes and shelter. Jesus himself came eating and drinking with clothes on his back, even as he fed the hungry and healed the sick and clothed the naked. He had the necessities of life, and so he made his life's work making sure that others had those same necessities. Again, Larry Lowhead's point, just as every person needs the means to live on, so every person needs some ends to live for. And those ends are what got this guy in trouble. It's why he's called foolish. He gets so wrapped up in the means to live on that he mistook them for the ends to live for. That is to say, his livelihood became his life. He was absorbed in his ownings and obsessed with his possessions. Now, the reality is, for most of us here, not all of us I know, but for many of us and for many in our country, the real problem for us is not subsistence, right? Having enough to live on. Our struggle is finding meaning for our existence. We know, most of us, how to acquire the means to live on. But our issue is making those means serve some kind of worthwhile end. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's Babylon Revisited, the main character walks into a bar in Paris. The time is just after the 1929 economic collapse. The bartender says to the man, "I heard that you lost a lot in the crash." "I did," he answered, "but I lost everything I wanted in the boom." This is what happened to the man in the parable. He lost, or had sacrificed, everything worthwhile in the boom, so to speak. He lost it in the process of producing more crops, building bigger barns, etc. It was not his physical death that made a fool out of him. It was the death that took place in the midst of his living. It was the death of an interest in the things that money cannot buy, while he amassed the things that money can buy. It was the death of any worthwhile ends to live for in the midst of his preoccupations with accumulating the means to live on. You see, it was an early death occurring long before that fateful night when God alerted him to the fact that he would physically die that night. His spirit had been dying a slow death for many years. There is not a problem with possessing wealth, but there is great peril in being possessed by wealth. When we are defined by what we own ends up owning us. And more importantly, perhaps, one way possessions can own us is by demanding our time and effort, right, to keep them up. If we're afraid to lose our possessions, we'll spend a lot of time and effort defending and protecting them and making sure they're secure. All of this got me thinking about where our obsession with stuff comes from and how to free ourselves from it. It seems to me that the source of what we could call greed might be a lack of satisfaction of something in our lives. I'm not saying that we don't have seasons in life where we really are struggling. But there is always something or someone or some pinhole of light for which we can be grateful. It seems that we just don't always have it in us to look at where we are today, what we have, what we're doing, and say to ourselves that it's just fine the way it is. We're okay. Sometimes we just always want to change something. There's always another golden calf out there that we imagine will make our lives complete. But no matter how much stuff we manage to acquire or how hard we work, it's never enough. There's still an empty place inside of us that can't be filled with newer and better and nicer things. Some of us don't have as much of an issue with things as we do with our schedules and activities. We fill that void by running from place to place. If we work hard long enough, we can distract ourselves from the real question that perhaps haunts us, the question of what it will take to be truly happy and content with our lives and with God. It can be a painful question, only because it's not easy to answer. So some of us would rather not face it at all. And so we run from one thing to the next, immersing ourselves in busyness so that we won't have to think about that uncertainty or emptiness that gnaws at us when we get quiet and still. Centuries ago, the early church father, St. Augustine, said, "Thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee." Whatever and whoever God is to you, you will be restless until you can rest in God, your Creator, the source of your life and your breath and your being, and know that all that you are and all that you have comes as a gift from God. You are a steward of whatever wealth or blessings or successes that you have. You don't own it. We'll always struggle to find meaning until we grasp that all that we have and all that we are is God's. The ancient truth is that the only way to be free from the obsessions that fail to satisfy us is through focusing on the steadfast love and generosity and blessings of God. It is a love that surrounds us constantly. It is a love that is in the very air that we breathe. And if God's love can be in something so essential to our lives, surely we can find it in other places in our lives too, if we have eyes to see it, or the will to bring God's love into all that we have and all that we are. I want you now to open up your order of worship again and fill out the right side of your chart. In general, list the top 5 ways that you connect with God and others. For me, one of those ways is yoga. It might be going to the mountains for you, or reading scriptures, or coming to worship. And in the second column, I'd like you to list the top 5 ways you give of your finances and of your own time and talent to God. This could be giving to Calvary or another nonprofit, or maybe you have the gift of hospitality or teaching. But fill out that right side of the chart, and I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I'd like you to draw some lines between any overlap that you see between the two charts. Are there ways in which you've spent time and energy this week that match the ways that you connect with God and others? Are there ways that you've spent your money this week that match your best ways of giving to God? See if there's some overlap and note that. If there's not overlap, do not judge yourself. Simply note the incongruence between the two charts. I did this myself, and I only had one area of overlap. This exercise is meant to be a spiritual checkup, if you will. An honest assessment about whether the ways in which you're spending your time and energy and money and resources, specifically the way that you spent them this past week, align with the ways you connect with God best and give to God and serve God best. Are you living the life you want to live when you think about what's most important to you and to God and to our world? Because the final point of today's text is that we cannot afford to let anything, money or busy schedules or job promotions or societal pressures or family expectations or politics, to come between us and God. Because life is precious. Time is short. Jesus' parable emphasizes this. Now is the time to get our life aligned with how God is calling us to live. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next year, not when we have the new job, not when the kids are old enough and in school, not when we retire, not when we get married or divorced or have the baby or move to a new city or go off to college. Now. There are precious few hours between when the man in our parable kicks up his feet and dreams about his future of eating, drinking, and being merry, and when God says his life will be taken from him. A life of amassing wealth and property does not buy us any more minutes or hours, nor does a life of climbing some illusory ladder of success. In fact, sometimes those things can rob us of the very minutes and hours we have to spend with God and with those we love, if we're not careful. In the end, our life is measured not by how much stuff we have or how successful we were, or even by how many good deeds we have done. Our life is measured by the depth and breadth of our relationship with God, how that relationship permeates our soul and every part of our being, and how that relationship influences all other relationships and every part of our doing, including how we love and care for ourselves and for our neighbor and for the world. So the question I leave you with is this: to what end are you living your life? And when all is said and done, will you be satisfied with that end when your life here on earth ends? Think about that.